Imagine you're the President of the United States. You're sitting in the Oval Office, staring at a map, and you notice something terrifying. There's a massive frozen island sitting between you and your rivals. It's melting, it's valuable, and it's not yours. So you pick up the phone, call the leader of Denmark, and ask one simple question. How much? When Donald Trump suggested buying Greenland in 2019, the world laughed. Late-night hosts roasted him. Memes flooded the internet. Denmark called it absurd. But here's what nobody told you. Trump wasn't the first American president to try this. He was actually the third. The United States has been trying to acquire Greenland for over 100 years. And the reason isn't ego. It's about minerals that power your smartphone. It's about missiles. It's about controlling the Arctic as the ice disappears. Before we dive into this geopolitical chess game, hit that subscribe button and join the Wealth Forum community. We break down the economics and strategy behind the world's biggest power moves. Now, let's talk about the biggest real estate deal that never happened and why it might actually happen soon. Let's get one thing straight before we go any further. The idea of buying Greenland didn't start with a tweet. If you want to understand America's obsession with this frozen island, you have to go back to 1867, the year the United States bought Alaska from Russia. The man behind that deal was Secretary of State William Seward. Critics called it Seward's folly, a waste of money on frozen wasteland, until they found gold and oil. And suddenly Seward looked like a genius. But here's what most history books skip. Seward didn't just want Alaska. He commissioned secret studies exploring the acquisition of Greenland and Iceland. His logic was brutally simple. Control the North Atlantic choke points, dominate shipping routes, project American power into the Arctic. It was 19th century empire building at its finest. Fast forward to 1946. World War II just ended. The Soviet Union is rising. And President Harry Truman understands that the next war won't be fought in trenches. It will be fought in the sky with bombers flying over the North Pole. So, Truman did something extraordinary. He made Denmark a formal offer. $100 million in gold. Not paper money, not bonds. Literal gold bullion for Greenland. The Joint Chiefs of Staff described Greenland as indispensable to American safety. Without it, Soviet bombers could reach American cities with minimal warning time. Denmark said no, politely but firmly. But America didn't walk away. They just changed tactics. If you can't buy the house, rent the guest room forever. In 1951, a defense agreement gave the US permanent military access to Greenland. That foothold still exists today. And here's the kicker. Denmark has sold territory to America before. In 1917, the US bought the Danish West Indies for $25 million in gold. Today we call them the US Virgin Islands. So when Trump brought this up in 2019, he wasn't proposing something crazy. He was reviving a century-old strategy that never actually died. Now let's put on our military strategist hat and look at a map. Not a flat classroom map, a globe. When you do that, Greenland stops looking like a random blob of ice. It becomes the most important piece of real estate you've never thought about. There's something called the Geopolitical gap. That stands for Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. It's one of the most critical naval choke points on Earth. Here's why it matters. Imagine you're a Russian submarine captain with nuclear missiles. Your job is to get from your Arctic base into the open Atlantic, where you can threaten North America. There's really only one practical route. You have to squeeze through the Geopolitical gap between Greenland and Iceland, or between Iceland and the UK. For NATO, this corridor is a monitored kill zone. It's covered by underwater sensors, patrol aircraft, satellites, and decades of surveillance infrastructure. If you control Greenland, you control the western wall of that gate. And here's the beautiful part from a military perspective. You can sink ships, you can disable aircraft carriers, but you cannot sink an island. Greenland is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, sitting permanently between North America, Europe, and Russia. Control of Greenland means permanent forward basing for radar, missiles, aircraft, and early warning systems. In military terms, distance equals reaction time, and reaction time saves lives. A missile launched from Moscow travels about 5,000 miles to reach Washington, D.C., but from northern Greenland to Moscow, barely over 2,000 miles. Geography compresses warning time and amplifies strategic leverage. Now here's where it gets complicated in 2026. Greenland isn't just Danish territory anymore. It's a self-governing region with its own parliament and a growing independence movement. The population is tiny, just 57,000 people, smaller than an NFL stadium. And they're starting to think about full independence from Denmark. But there's a problem. An independent Greenland would need money. A lot of it. And when small countries need infrastructure financing, someone always shows up with a checkbook. That someone is usually China. We've seen this playbook before. Sri Lanka's port that became Chinese-controlled. Djibouti's base that gave China its first overseas military foothold. Infrastructure loans become strategic leverage. US defense planners are terrified of a scenario where China gains operational influence in Greenland, not through purchase, through debt, through ports and airports and logistics access. If that happens, the Guyuk Gap becomes far harder to secure. The US would lose its Arctic shield. So when Trump said buy it, the delivery was clumsy. But the strategic logic underneath wasn't crazy. It was a blunt attempt to block Chinese encroachment before it starts. But China's interest isn't just about shipping lanes. It's about what's buried under the ice. Let's talk about the real prize. Your smartphone, your electric car, your laptop, the guidance system inside a cruise missile. All of them run on something called rare earth elements. And Greenland is sitting on one of the largest deposits outside China. There's a site in southern Greenland called Kvanefjeld. Geological surveys confirm enormous quantities of rare earth minerals, high-performance magnets, guidance systems, electric motors, radar, satellites. None of it works without rare earths. Advanced weapons systems require hundreds of pounds of these materials per platform. Fighter jets, submarines, missile defense, all of it depends on rare earth supply chains. Here's the nightmare for Washington. China controls roughly 80 to 90% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. Even when these minerals are mined elsewhere, they get shipped to China for refining. If Beijing ever restricted exports, Western manufacturing and defense production would collapse overnight. Greenland represents one of the few paths to breaking that monopoly. Company estimates suggest the Kvanefjeld deposit alone contains over 1 million metric tons of rare earth oxides. But here's the uncomfortable truth. While American politicians were joking about buying Greenland, a Chinese company quietly acquired a major stake in the development rights to Kvanefjeld. China now has meaningful influence over one of the most strategic mineral deposits on the planet. Buying Greenland isn't about expansion. It's about preventing the factory of the world from controlling the raw materials of the next industrial era. Now let me tell you a ghost story about what America has already done in Greenland that most people don't know about. In 1959, the US Army Corps of Engineers showed up with smiles and shovels. They told Denmark they were building a harmless scientific research station under the ice. What they actually built was a small underground city. It had living quarters, a hospital, a chapel, a movie theater, and 200 personnel at peak capacity. It was powered by one of the first portable nuclear reactors ever deployed in the field. The public story was science. The real mission was called Project Iceworm. The plan was extraordinary and terrifying. The military wanted to carve thousands of miles of tunnels beneath the ice sheet to hide hundreds of nuclear missiles. The missiles would constantly move on underground rail systems, making them impossible for Soviet surveillance to track or destroy. It sounded like a James Bond movie. There was just one problem: ice moves. Engineers completely underestimated how aggressively the glacier would deform the tunnels. Walls warped, ceilings shifted. Maintenance became overwhelming. By the mid-1960s, the Pentagon quietly admitted defeat. Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. They removed the reactor core but left everything else behind. Tens of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, toxic materials, sewage, low-level radioactive waste, all buried under layers of ice. At the time, planners assumed the ice would stay frozen forever. That assumption is now collapsing. As Arctic temperatures rise, scientists warn that parts of Camp Century could thaw, potentially releasing contaminated meltwater into the ecosystem. Today, America's presence is less secret but far more important. The installation formerly known as Thule Air Base is now Patuxent Space Base, the northernmost US military installation on Earth. It hosts a powerful early warning radar that scans continuously for ballistic missile launches over the polar region. It's a critical pillar of America's missile defense architecture. If access to this base were ever compromised, early warning coverage over the Arctic would be significantly weakened, which is why, from Washington's perspective, owning Greenland wouldn't just simplify diplomacy, it would permanently lock down one of the most sensitive radar locations on the planet. But there's something even bigger happening: climate change. And here's the darkest irony of the 21st century. Climate change is a catastrophe for the planet, but a potential goldmine for global commerce. For most of human history, the Arctic Ocean was a frozen wall. If you wanted to ship containers from Shanghai to Europe, you had to go the long way, through the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, up through the Suez Canal. That journey takes 30 to 40 days. But as Arctic ice retreats, new routes are opening. Russia's northern sea route hugs the Siberian coastline. In summer, it can cut 10 to 15 days off the journey. That's a 25 to 35% reduction in transit time. Fuel savings alone translate to billions annually for shipping companies. In the future, an even more direct path called the Transpolar Sea Route could cut straight across the central Arctic Ocean. That route isn't reliable yet, but planners are already preparing. There's also the Northwest Passage threading through Canada's Arctic near Greenland. Greenland sits at the gateway of all these emerging sea lanes. Whoever builds the ports, refueling hubs, and repair infrastructure nearby becomes the logistical toll booth of the future Arctic economy. China openly calls this vision the Polar Silk Road. Russia already charges transit fees and escort costs along its coastline. But none of this infrastructure exists in Greenland yet. There are few deep water ports, limited emergency facilities, minimal shipping services. Building it requires massive capital. If Denmark can't afford it and the US doesn't step in, someone else will. And the country with the biggest infrastructure checkbook is China. Owning Greenland wouldn't give legal control over international waters, but it would give enormous influence over the ports and security footprint that make those routes usable. Now let's talk about the real trap Washington is setting. It's what I call the independence trap. Here's the reality. Greenland already has its own parliament, its own flag, and control over most domestic policy. But its passport still says Denmark. And foreign policy is decided in Copenhagen, nearly 2,000 miles away. Polls show that 60 to 80% of Greenlanders support independence in principle. The dream is real, but there's a massive catch. Every year, Denmark sends Greenland about $600 million. That single payment covers more than half of Greenland's public budget and roughly a fifth of its entire economy. That money pays for hospitals, schools, infrastructure, and social services. Without it, the economy would collapse overnight. So here's the brutal truth. Greenland cannot afford to be independent unless someone replaces Denmark's money. This is where strategy shifts from buying land to buying influence. If Greenland votes for independence, the Danish subsidy disappears. The new government would desperately need replacement funding. And whoever steps in first with cash, investment, and security guarantees becomes the most important partner. If the US were to say congratulations on independence, we'll replace that funding, invest in your infrastructure, and guarantee your security in exchange for military access and mineral rights, Washington would gain enormous leverage for a relatively modest cost. We're already seeing the groundwork. In 2020, the US reopened a consulate in Nuuk for the first time since the 1950s. It came with $12 million in civilian aid aimed at development. Denmark publicly welcomed it, but privately officials were clearly uneasy. It's the geopolitical equivalent of quietly saying you don't need your old partner anymore, we can take care of you. And the risk cuts both ways. If the US hesitates, China is ready with fast financing and far fewer political conditions. So the real race isn't to buy land. It's to become the preferred partner of a future independent Greenland. But while Washington, Beijing, and Copenhagen play chess with the map, the people actually living on the ice are facing a tragedy. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. To understand why Greenland is vulnerable, you have to look at its wounds. In 1951, Denmark launched a social experiment that still haunts them. They removed 22 Inuit children from their families and sent them to Denmark. The goal was to modernize them culturally, erase their language, turn them into model citizens. It was social engineering disguised as education. When the children returned, many no longer spoke their own language. They felt alien in their communities. Several struggled with addiction and early death. In 2022, Denmark formally apologized. But apologies don't erase generational trauma. Walk through Greenland today, and you'll see posters that say the call is free. No one is alone. They're not advertising a phone plan. They're advertising a suicide hotline. Greenland has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, especially among young men. Long winter darkness, historical trauma, isolation, rapid cultural change, limited mental health services. It's created a quiet crisis that touches nearly every family. When politicians casually talk about buying Greenland, they're not talking about empty land. They're talking about a population that's hurting and deeply sensitive to being treated like a commodity. And there's one more wound. For thousands of years, the Inuit hunter and the sled dog were inseparable. You couldn't survive the Arctic without dogs. Today that bond is breaking. As sea ice forms later and melts earlier, traditional hunting seasons have collapsed. Without hunting, feeding sled dogs becomes impossible. Some hunters have been forced to euthanize dogs they can no longer support. Over the past 2 decades, Greenland's sled dog population has declined by 40 to 50%. It's a visceral symbol of a culture caught between two worlds, the old Arctic way fading, the promised new economy of minerals and shipping not yet arriving, and now we're here. January 2026. What started as a joke has become deadly serious. The White House confirmed that President Trump and his team are actively exploring options for securing Greenland. In a press briefing, Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt said utilizing the US military is always an option. That statement sent shockwaves through Europe. Denmark swiftly reaffirmed that Greenland is not for sale and its sovereignty must be respected. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and European leaders warned that any use of force would undermine the foundations of the international order. It's worth being clear. The US has not mobilized forces to invade. But what has changed is the tone, from sideline idea to national security priority. Some lawmakers frame the rhetoric as pressure on Denmark to negotiate. Secretary of State Marco Rubio emphasized the goal is diplomatic resolution, though he hasn't ruled out force entirely. Meanwhile, France, Germany, and Canada have publicly supported Greenland's sovereignty and warned that coercion would strain NATO and set a dangerous precedent. What this means is we're watching a dramatic geopolitical escalation. Not armed conflict yet, but the stakes are immense. Strategic Arctic access, control of critical minerals, the future of a territory under Danish sovereignty for 3 centuries. Whether this becomes conflict or returns to diplomacy remains unknown. But the tone is unmistakably serious for the first time in decades. So why does the United States want to buy Greenland? It's not about ice. It's not about ruining a pristine landscape. It's because the map of the world is changing. For 500 years, the Atlantic Ocean was the center of power. For the last 50 years, it was the Pacific. But the next 50 years will be decided in the north. Greenland is the cork in the bottle. It holds the minerals for our technology, the radar for our defense, the keys to new oceans opening at the top of the world. The United States sees Greenland as a shield. China sees it as a battery. Denmark sees it as a responsibility. And the Greenlanders just want stability, dignity, and a future their children can survive in. The question isn't whether Greenland will become more valuable. It will. The question is how the world handles that value. With diplomacy, with money, or eventually with force. The ice is melting. And as it disappears, it's revealing the most dangerous thing of all. Greed. This isn't just about one frozen island. It's about what happens when resources become scarce and powerful. Nations stop asking permission. It's about the future being fought over before it even arrives. So here's my question for you. If you were Greenland, who would you trust? The country that colonized you? The superpower that wants to own you? Or the rival that wants to finance you? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this deep dive into geopolitical strategy opened your eyes, do me a favor, smash that like button. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss our breakdowns of the world's biggest power moves here at the Wealth Forum. Because trust me, the Arctic Cold War is just getting started, and the next chapter is going to be even wilder. I'll see you in the next one.